It was a grey and thoughtful morning in Norfolk, the kind of morning that seemed to have mislaid the sun somewhere among the low, damp meadows. A thin mist clung to the hedgerows, reluctant to disperse, and the sea beyond the marshes murmured like a housemaid talking in her sleep. Lord Peter Wimsey, who had come down ostensibly to attend a small antiquarian sale at Calthorpe Hall, was enjoying himself immensely. He had found the local vicar, the Reverend Mr. Haddington, to be both a collector of 16th-century devotional prints and a man of such guileless conversation that Wimsey could spend an entire evening in his company without once resorting to bridge. It was at breakfast, however, on that particular morning in early October, that the matter of the mirror first arose. "It's a curious thing, my lord," said Bunter, with that air of well-trained disapproval which was his master's most reliable weather vane. "But Mr. Haddington has just telephoned. He says there's been, well, an occurrence." Lord Peter glanced up from his kippers with mild interest. "Good heavens, Bunter, not a burglary. I had the impression that crime, like fog, preferred to keep to the larger towns." "So I believed, my lord. But it appears that something rather odd has taken place at the Hall. The old Venetian mirror, part of the late Lady Calthorpe's collection, has, as Mr. Haddington puts it, ceased to reflect properly." Wimsey raised his eyebrows. "Mirrors are notoriously unreliable fellows, Bunter. They'll flatter a fool and betray a philosopher. But cease to reflect. How charmingly metaphysical of it. Do we take that to mean it's cracked?" "Apparently not, my lord. It seems the glass is perfectly intact. Only—" Bunter hesitated, a thing he very rarely did. "Only, it no longer shows the image of anyone who stands before it." There was a pause. Wimsey dabbed delicately at his mouth with a napkin. "A mirror that refuses to acknowledge humanity. How very topical." He rose, reached for his cigarette case, and added, "Well, we can't have that, can we? If even inanimate objects begin to display moral superiority, society will crumble altogether. Fetch the car, Bunter." The Hall stood in the hollow of a hill like a forgotten thought, half Tudor and half Georgian, and all of it a little uneasy in its own company. A solitary rook cawed from the chimney-stack as Wimsey and Bunter approached, and the great front door, painted the precise shade of melancholy blue that only English gentry seemed to find comforting, was opened by a housekeeper whose expression suggested that she disapproved equally of death, laughter, and visitors. Mr. Haddington met them in the hall, pink-faced and visibly distressed. "Lord Peter, I'm most grateful. I know it sounds absurd, but it's the strangest thing. Old Lady Calthorpe's Venetian mirror, the one hanging over the fireplace in the East Gallery. This morning, when I came to dust it, well, there was nothing there. Nothing at all. No reflection. Not even of myself. I assure you, I thought I was having some sort of turn. But I called Mrs. Graves. She couldn't see herself either. Nor could young Markham, the gardener. The surface is bright as ever, but blank. It's like looking into a windowless night." Wimsey, whose interest had sharpened at the mention of dusting, strolled toward the East Gallery. The corridor smelled faintly of sea salt and beeswax, with that undertone of faded rose-water which clings to old estates and older secrets. The mirror in question was a tall, narrow rectangle of Venetian workmanship, its frame carved with leaping cherubs and garlands of fruit. It gave off no visible flaw. Yet when Wimsey approached it, he saw indeed nothing. No reflection of himself, no echo of the room behind him, only a depthless, unresponsive surface like dark water. "Bunter," said Wimsey quietly, "would you oblige me?" Bunter stepped forward, his reflection likewise absent. He nodded once, as if confirming a private suspicion. "If I might say so, my lord, this is uncommonly rum, yes. Though I suspect the explanation, when it comes, will be rather less romantic than the phenomenon deserves." Wimsey bent close, peering along the edge of the frame. "There's something about the light here. The window behind us, the angle of the hearth. Perhaps a cunning trick of reflection upon reflection. Still, he paused, his expression shifting subtly from curiosity to calculation. You say this mirror was part of Lady Calthorpe's collection. Remind me, when did she die? 3 years ago, said Mr. Haddington. Quite suddenly, in this very room. Heart failure, the doctor said. Whimsy's gaze lingered on the mirror, which seemed to absorb rather than reflect the daylight. Heart failure, he murmured. How discouragingly tidy. He straightened, brushing a speck of dust from his sleeve. Well, Mr. Haddington, since we are here, perhaps we might take a little inventory of the hall's curiosities. I'm told such objects often grow jealous of neglect. Mirrors, especially. Vain things, after all. They dislike being forgotten. And as he spoke, a clock somewhere in the house began to strike the hour. 4 chimes, followed by a curious dragging echo that did not quite match the rhythm. Whimsy's eyes flickered upward, as though he had noted a point in a crossword clue. That clock, he said lightly. Does it often do that? Do what, my lord? Answer itself. Mrs. Graves, the housekeeper of Calthorpe Hall, was a monument to propriety and bombazine. She had a nose that appeared to have been designed for the detection of moral decay, and a voice that could make the 10 Commandments sound like household instructions. When Lord Peter requested a few words in private, she received him with the air of one who feared that conversation itself might lead to moral compromise. If you please, my lord, we've had enough disturbances in this house since her ladyship passed, without people traipsing about asking questions. The master's nerves are not what they were. I sympathize deeply, said Whimsy, with that soothing drawl which always suggested amusement dressed as concern. But I am sure you'll agree that a mirror which refuses to perform its duty is a serious domestic lapse. I cannot imagine what the Daily Mail would say if the story got out. That silenced her for a moment. Mrs. Graves led him down the passage to the servants' sitting room, where a small fire burned with the self-conscious air of an underfed guest. Bunter, unobtrusively present, stood by the door, his gaze politely blank. Now, said Whimsy, settling himself, I gather you were the first to notice the misbehavior of the mirror? Indeed not, my lord. It was Mr. Haddington himself. He's been fussing over those relics ever since Lady Calthorpe died. Says she told him they'd be worth a fortune one day. I says to him, Sir, I says, it's unlucky to meddle with what's meant to stay shut up. But he will poke about. Quite so. Did her ladyship keep the mirror covered then? She did, my lord. Always had a length of black silk thrown over it. Said it showed too much light for her taste. We never dusted it but when she was away. She didn't like to see it. Said it made her look ill. Whimsy's eyes flicked up, but his tone remained conversational. Ah. And you say she died in that room? Yes, my lord. Sitting in front of the fire, just as you saw it. The doctor said heart failure, but there were some as thought, well, she wasn't a happy woman. Her husband was dead, her son abroad, and there were talks, my lord. Oh, yes. Talks about a gentleman who used to visit from Norwich. A man of art, so they said. Art, repeated Whimsy softly, as if the word had an unpleasant aftertaste. Do you happen to recall his name? Mrs. Graves compressed her lips. No, my lord, but he was the kind that wears scarves and calls ordinary people dear souls. I'll warrant he had no good to do with her ladyship. At that moment, Bunter interjected in his quiet, respectful way. Begging your pardon, my lord, but if Mrs. Graves will allow, I wonder who last polished the mirror. Polished, sniffed Mrs. Graves. Nobody, sir. Not since her ladyship's passing. It's been kept as she left it. Only this week Mr. Haddington insisted we take the cloth off for the parish open day. That was Wednesday. Ah, said Whimsy. Then the mirror began its little protest 2 days later. A temperamental thing, perhaps. The housekeeper looked at him suspiciously, as though mirrors were not the only objects in danger of impertinence. I've said from the first that there's something unholy about that glass, she muttered, "and I'll thank heaven when it's taken out of the house." Outside the servants' room, the passage was dim, lined with portraits that watched one another in weary disapproval. Whimsy strolled along, pausing before a particularly gloomy canvas of Sir Peregrine Calthorpe, KCB, who appeared to have been painted by a man with a grudge. "Bunter," he said half to himself, "you observe that servants, when questioned, never lie. They merely substitute moral disapproval for factual precision. Very ingenious." "Indeed, my lord. We must have a word with the gardener. Markham, wasn't it? I always find the outdoor staff delightfully frank. Soil breeds honesty." Markham was found by the potting shed, smoking a pipe with the slow satisfaction of a man who had outlived both employers and scruples. He touched his cap when Whimsy approached, but did not appear otherwise disconcerted by a peer of the realm descending upon his turnips. "That mirror, my lord," he said when asked. "Oh, aye, I saw it. Gave me a turn, it did. I don't hold with them foreign things. Glass that don't show faces, clocks that strike twice, all that nonsense. Bad luck, I says. You noticed the clock as well? The big one in the East Gallery. Always been queer, that clock. Strikes once more than it should, sometimes before the hour, sometimes after. Her ladyship couldn't abide it, said it made her head ache. Used to keep it stopped, she did. The vicar started it up again last month." Whimsy gave a small, thoughtful whistle. A clock that refuses obedience and a mirror that refuses reflection. We are quite the household of rebellious inanimates, Bunter. "Very good, my lord," said Bunter, noting something discreetly in his pocket-book. "Tell me, Markham," Whimsy continued, "did you notice anything odd about the gallery windows? Drafts, noises, anything that might make the light shift about?" The gardener scratched his head. "Well, the top left pane's been cracked since the storm last year. Lets in a queer sort of glimmer when the sun's low. Makes the room look alive, if you take my meaning. Like something's moving that isn't." "I take it exactly," said Whimsy. "Thank you, Markham. You've been of immense assistance." When they were out of earshot, Bunter ventured, "If I may remark, my lord, these phenomena, mirror, clock, window, seem to share a certain alignment." "They do indeed, Bunter. Light, time, and reflection. 3 faithful servants of perception, all behaving badly at once. If I were a mystic, I should say the house has lost its shadow. Fortunately, I'm a detective. By late afternoon, Whimsy had contrived to interview every soul within reach of Calthorpe Hall, from the trembling parlour maid who swore she had seen a shape in the glass, to the cook who swore she had not, but wished she had. Their accounts varied only in emphasis and piety. None could explain why the mirror had turned obstinate, though each had a suspicion that it was connected somehow with her ladyship. Mr. Haddington himself was no help. He hovered about the gallery, wringing his hands. "It's blasphemous, that's what it is," he muttered. "A punishment, perhaps, for pride. She was vain, Lord Peter. Terribly vain. Always had to have her face just so, her hair just right. That mirror was her altar." "Yes," said Whimsy absently, studying the back of the frame. "And like most altars, it probably conceals a small but inconvenient compartment." "Oh, compartment. Only a guess. The Italians love that sort of thing. Secret drawers for jewels or letters. I shouldn't be surprised if... His fingers had found a slight irregularity along the carved cherubs. With delicate pressure, he slid aside a panel no larger than a handkerchief. Inside lay a small, tarnished key and a scrap of faded ribbon. "Her ladyship's?" "Almost certainly," said Whimsy. "And possibly belonging to a box or cabinet. Something equally private. Where might such a thing have been kept?" "In her dressing room, I suppose. It's been locked since she died." "Then perhaps," said Whimsy, smiling faintly, "we might request permission to disturb the dust of the departed. Bunter, make a note. The dead are never tidy, however much they are mourned." He turned once more toward the mirror, whose surface seemed to shimmer faintly in the dying light. For an instant, Whimsy thought he caught the outline of his own face, distorted as though beneath rippling water. Then it vanished, leaving only the dull gleam of glass. "Curious," he murmured. "A mirror that conceals, a clock that lies, a housekeeper who disapproves, and a lady who covered her own reflection. One begins to suspect that the crime here, Bunter, may be something subtler than theft." "Murder, my lord." "Possibly," said Whimsy with a faint, almost tender smile. "Or perhaps merely vanity taken to its logical conclusion." The discovery of the key lent the afternoon an air of polite excitement, like a clergyman's tea party interrupted by the faint smell of brimstone. Whimsy, holding the little object between finger and thumb, examined it with the idle absorption of a man testing the authenticity of a truffle. It was delicate, gilt, and of Italian workmanship, its teeth fine as lacework, its bow shaped like a fleur-de-lis. He turned it once in his palm, then slipped it into his waistcoat pocket as one might pocket an invitation to scandal. Mr. Haddington watched, in visible agitation. "You're not suggesting, surely, that Lady Calthorpe hid something behind that glass? She was a woman of taste, eccentric perhaps, but not secretive." "My dear sir," said Whimsy amiably, "everybody is secretive, especially the tasteful. It is the only way they can preserve their superiority over those who have nothing to conceal." They proceeded, with Mrs. Graves reluctantly in attendance, to the late Lady Calthorpe's dressing-room, a high, pale chamber facing north, where the light had the silvery melancholy of a winter morning even in October. The air was faintly perfumed with old lavender and disuse. Dust motes drifted above a vanity table littered with bottles that had long since surrendered their scents. The mirror there was small and obedient, its glass slightly foxed, but still dutiful enough to present a reflection. Whimsy tried the key in the lock of a narrow cabinet that stood against the wall. It fitted with gratifying neatness. Within lay an assortment of trifles: a miniature in ivory, a glove yellowed with age, a roll of faded ribbon, and, at the back, a folded packet sealed with brittle red wax. He drew it out delicately. The wax bore a smudged impression of some kind of bird, perhaps a heron. Bunter produced a penknife, and Whimsy cut through the seal with a motion at once reverent and amused. Inside was a letter, written in a sloping, elegant hand that betrayed the self-conscious artistry of an emotional woman. "My dearest Elle, if I cannot have you in life, I will have you in the glass. You said once that reflections do not die, they only wait. Come when the clock strikes 4, and you will see what I have seen." Yours always, Mr. Haddington's complexion became a shade paler. "Good heavens," he said weakly. She was writing to someone. Elle, but who could that be? Whimsy folded the letter. Possibly the man from Norwich, the artistic gentleman Mrs. Graves disapproves of. Painters have an inconvenient habit of inspiring confidences. It's part of their trade. But in the glass? That sounds, unnatural. "Unnatural?" said Whimsy, tucking the letter away. "Merely poetic, I suspect, though I shall be interested to know whether the gentleman in question ever came to see her when the clock struck 4. He turned to Bunter, who was already examining the room with his usual air of discreet omniscience. "Notice anything peculiar about the furnishings?" "The mirror here, my lord," Bunter replied quietly, "is of the same make as the one in the gallery. Venetian, gilt border, similar carving, but smaller." "Ah," said Whimsy. "A family resemblance. I should not be surprised if they were made as a pair." Mrs. Graves, hovering by the door, gave a sniff that could have pickled fruit. It's not right, prying into her ladyship's private things. She was a good woman for all her little ways. I won't hear otherwise. "I have no intention of speaking otherwise," said Whimsy kindly. "The trouble with good women, Mrs. Graves, is that they so often find themselves in the company of bad mirrors. The glass, unlike the soul, is impartial." As they descended the staircase, The sound of the gallery clock floated down, 4 strokes, each followed by that dragging echo Whimsy had noticed before. He paused halfway. "There it is again," he murmured. "The answer to the hour. Very curious." Mr. Haddington frowned. "I've told the clockmaker about it. He says the mechanism's sound. It must be the acoustics of the hall." "Acoustics," said Whimsy softly. "Yes, acoustics can be most deceitful." He went back into the east gallery, where the late sunlight spilled faintly across the boards. The mirror loomed, serene and blank as ever. Bunter, at his master's nod, drew the curtains, altering the light. A faint shiver seemed to run through the room as if the air had contracted. "Now then," said Whimsy. 4 o'clock, reflections waiting, and a lady who disliked to see herself. "Tell me, Bunter, what does that suggest to your professional mind?" "That the mirror, my lord, reflects what it chooses, or what is placed before it to reflect." "Exactly. A mirror, after all, is only as truthful as its alignment. What appears to vanish may simply be diverted." He stepped close, tracing the edge of the frame with a gloved finger. The carving showed faint signs of interference. Minute scratches, almost invisible. "This frame has been opened before," he said. "Recently, too. Mr. Haddington, has anyone touched this since your arrival?" "No, no one. Unless, well, the vicar from Norwich came last week. Mr. Lane, he's called. Said he'd known her ladyship slightly, years ago, and wanted to see the collection before the sale." "Lane?" repeated Whimsy. "How remarkably convenient. You see, Bunter, our mysterious correspondent takes on flesh." He smiled, but his eyes had sharpened. "I think it is time we met this Mr. Lane. Where is he lodging?" "At the King's Arms in the village. He's been sketching the ruins near the marsh, so he says." "Excellent. Artists are such obliging people. They always leave traces of themselves. Shall we call on him tomorrow, Bunter? I have a curiosity to see whether his reflection is still in good working order." That evening after dinner, Whimsy returned alone to the gallery. The household had retired early, leaving the corridors in darkness. He carried a small torch, its beam slicing across the portraits, which looked briefly startled before lapsing again into dignified gloom. The mirror stood silent, swallowing his light. He held up the torch to its surface. The beam vanished, absorbed utterly, as though cast into deep water. The sensation was oddly physical, a faint tug at the eyes. For a moment, he fancied he saw a flicker, some faint outline of a woman's face, pale and luminous. But it might have been only the ghost of his own reflection caught in distortion. The clock began to strike. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then, after the briefest pause, a 5th, softer note out of rhythm. Whimsy turned sharply. The air trembled. Somewhere, a latch clicked faintly. When he looked back, the mirror was as empty as before. He waited, listening to the stillness settle again, then walked to the clock. Its pendulum swayed with mechanical serenity. He bent to examine the mechanism, noting a thin wire running behind the case, vanishing into the wall. It was not part of the original design. "Improvised connection," he murmured. "And recent." He straightened, smiling faintly. The supernatural is always most obligingly domestic when examined closely. When he rejoined Bunter in the hall, his expression was one of serene satisfaction. "We shall pay our respects to Mr. Lane first thing tomorrow. Bring the magnifying lens and the small torch, and Bunter, if possible, discover whether any workmen have been about the hall lately. Someone has been tampering with the electric fittings." "Very good, my lord." As Whimsy prepared for bed, he paused by the window. The moon hung over the marshes like a tarnished coin. Somewhere beyond, a bell sounded, a thin, wavering note, neither from church nor clock. It echoed faintly through the mist. Whimsy smiled to himself. "A mirror without a face," he murmured. "A clock that lies, and a man from Norwich who paints ruins. Altogether, Bunter, I fancy we have the makings of a rather excellent illusion. The question is, whose?" But Bunter, who was folding his master's waistcoat with ecclesiastical precision, only said, "Very good, my lord." And the room lapsed into the kind of silence that always precedes discovery. The mirror in the gallery, had anyone looked upon it just then, would have shown nothing at all, except, perhaps, a faint gleam, like the after-image of a vanished candle. The following morning dawned with that pallid indecision peculiar to the Norfolk coast, neither sunlight nor mist, but something betwixt, as though the sky itself were unwilling to commit to clarity. Lord Peter Wimsey, perfectly dressed in tweed and mild anticipation, descended to breakfast humming a fragment of Dowland. Bunter, who had anticipated his master's every requirement from toast to timetable, stood ready with the morning's post. "Nothing of particular moment, my lord," he said. "Only a note from Mr. Haddington. He regrets he cannot accompany you to the village, being occupied with the estate accounts." "Entirely reasonable," said Wimsey cheerfully. "An estate account is the one earthly purgatory in which neither sin nor arithmetic is ever adequately punished. Now, then, our artist." They drove into the village in the Bentley, the autumn air keen and salt from the sea. The King's Arms was a square, respectable inn, its signboard creaking faintly in the breeze, depicting a monarch with more benevolence than historical accuracy. The landlord, a genial fellow with side whiskers of impressive sincerity, informed them that Mr. Lane had gone out early to sketch near the ruins of St. Agnes Priory, but was expected back before noon. "Fine, gentlemanly sort," the landlord said, lowering his voice confidentially. "Bit queer in his ways, if you take me, sir. Talks to hisself something awful. And last night I'd swear I heard him coming down late from his room and going out the back. Near midnight it were." "Ah," said Wimsey, lighting a cigarette, no doubt seeking moonlight for inspiration. Artists thrive on improbable illumination. He thanked the man and strolled out toward the Priory ruins, taking the narrow lane that wound between hedges heavy with blackberries. The ruins soon rose ahead, arches half swallowed by ivy, a tower leaning as if weary of the centuries. Amid the stones stood a solitary figure with a sketchbook balanced on one knee. Mr. Lane was a tall, spare man in his 40s, dressed with the slightly theatrical care of one who knows himself to be observed. His hair, touched with grey, fell in a disorder that seemed carefully rehearsed. He greeted Wimsey with the weary politeness of a man who has suffered too many polite inquiries about his art. "Lord Peter Wimsey, at your service," said Wimsey pleasantly. "I believe you knew the late Lady Calthorpe?" A faint tightening at the corners of Lane's mouth betrayed the first fissure. "I did. Many years ago, when she still lived abroad. I was painting in Venice then. She purchased one of my pieces." "Indeed? A landscape or something more intimate?" Lane's gaze sharpened. "A mirror portrait. The Venetians have a tradition, you know, of capturing reflection rather than direct image. It fascinated her. She said she preferred to be seen as others saw her, filtered, elusive." "How singularly philosophical," murmured Wimsey. "And you came to Norfolk, I gather, to renew your acquaintance with her possessions." Lane smiled thinly. "I heard her collection was to be sold. I wished to see it once more, for sentiment's sake. The mirror, in particular." "The large Venetian one?" "Precisely. A fine piece. I arranged it for her myself years ago. Its balance of light was everything. I suppose it's lost some of its luster." "Curiously enough," said Wimsey, "it has lost something more tangible. It no longer reflects." Lane laughed, a little too quickly. "Superstitious nonsense. Mirrors do not die, Lord Peter. They simply distort when the world shifts around them." "Ah, but distortion can be most revealing," said Wimsey, his tone light. "Tell me, when you last adjusted it, did you happen to run a wire from the clock to the wall behind?" The artist's hand froze for a fraction of a second before continuing its idle sketching. "I beg your pardon?" "Pure curiosity. One finds the strangest things in old houses. Bells that ring by themselves, clocks that speak to mirrors. I sometimes wonder whether reflection might, like confession, require a little mechanical aid. Lane looked up, meeting Whimsy's eyes with forced amusement. You are teasing me, Lord Peter. Not at all. I merely observe. Observation, you see, is my profession. The conversation drifted to less perilous topics. Venetian technique, local weather, the moral inadequacies of English sunlight. Yet when Whimsy took his leave, he noticed that Lane's hand trembled slightly as he lifted his pencil once more. Back at the hall, Whimsy found Bunter awaiting him with the satisfaction of a man who has accomplished something morally and logistically pleasing. I've spoken with the electrician from the village, my lord. He did some wiring work here last month, mostly to the East Gallery. Said it was at the vicar's request to improve the lighting near the exhibits. Did he indeed? And did he happen to mention what sort of improvement? A concealed circuit, my lord, controlled by the gallery clock. The wiring runs behind the paneling. He thought it was for a lamp, but there's no lamp now. Whimsy's brows rose. How beautifully cooperative the dead can be when one asks the right questions. Her ladyship's clock strikes 4, the wire hums, and the mirror, perhaps it does not simply reflect. It projects. Mr. Haddington entered at that moment, looking harassed. Lord Peter, I must beg your indulgence. Mr. Lane has just been here. Very upset, I'm afraid. Says you accused him of tampering with the hall. My dear Haddington, said Whimsy mildly, I accused him of nothing. I merely invited him to reflect on his past. If he found the exercise disturbing, that is hardly my fault. He threatened to leave this very evening. I implored him to stay, of course. The sale committee is to view the collection tomorrow. Excellent, said Whimsy, apparently unperturbed. I should like him to remain precisely where he is. It saves trouble later. When Haddington had gone, Whimsy turned to Bunter. The plot thickens, my invaluable Bunter, and the moral tone degenerates. We have an artist with nerves, an electric trick, and a dead woman who wrote of meeting her lover in the glass. I should not be at all surprised if the lady had a notion to appear immortal, by art or by deceit. Bunter's expression did not alter. Then tonight, my lord, we shall test the mechanism. Exactly. We shall wait for the obliging hour of 4 and see whether the lady keeps her appointment. The evening passed in a hush of expectancy. Whimsy dined lightly, refusing coffee. At 3:45, he and Bunter slipped into the East Gallery, their footsteps muted on the boards. The mirror loomed in the half-dark, its surface dull as slate. The only sound was the slow pulse of the clock. As the 4th stroke sounded, a faint vibration ran through the wall, a low hum, electrical and alive. Then, slowly, the mirror began to brighten from within, as though catching light from an unseen flame. The glass shimmered, and a pale image emerged, soft, wavering, yet unmistakable, the outline of a woman's face. Whimsy stood motionless, eyes narrowed. The image flickered, then sharpened, high forehead, delicate chin, the suggestion of a smile. Suddenly, it dissolved into darkness. The hum ceased. Well, said Whimsy quietly, the lady keeps her time punctually, if not her substance. Bunter, open the panel behind the clock. Within lay the wire, joined to a small concealed lamp whose beam, when lit, fell through a cunning slit in the wall and upon the mirror's back. A slide of tinted glass, fitted behind the frame, bore a painted portrait. The same woman's features, translucent under light. Her ladyship's last vanity, murmured Whimsy. An artist's illusion, turned memorial. Lane's work, without doubt. She meant to surprise her guests with her own apparition until death made it permanent. Bunter examined the slide carefully. The paint's fresh, my lord. No more than a few weeks old. Whimsy smiled grimly. Then our Mr. Lane has been attending to her still. Love's labor, revisited by guilt. Tomorrow we shall give him a rather different exhibition. Outside, the clock ticked sedately, unaware of its complicity. The mirror, once more blank, seemed to wait, silent, deceptive, and entirely obedient to the next command of human folly. Morning returned with a deceptive calm, as though the house itself had not harbored ghosts in the small hours. The November air was brisk. A thin mist hung over the lawns, dissolving reluctantly as the first weak sunlight crept across the facade. The household was stirring, and servants moved about with a hushed diligence peculiar to those who sense that something, though undefined, is amiss. Whimsy sat at the breakfast table, his plate untouched, eyes half closed in a state of keen, meditative detachment. He had the air of a man idly playing with a puzzle piece he already knew the answer to, yet wished to savor the satisfaction of fitting it precisely. Bunter entered with a quiet rustle of efficiency. "The electrician's report, my lord. I took the liberty of asking him about the wiring's commission. He states that it was ordered and paid for in cash. The instructions were sent under the vicar's name, though he swears he had no knowledge of it." Whimsy looked up, eyebrows arching. "Ingenious. A false order, concealed beneath clerical virtue. I begin to think our artist is more than an amateur illusionist. What does one call the moral species that paints ghosts for profit and pays electricians in another man's name? A forger of souls, perhaps. There is another item, my lord." Bunter produced a small envelope. "Found this morning near the back entrance. Addressed to you." Whimsy slit it open delicately. Inside lay a single sheet of notepaper, water-stained and smudged, as if written in haste. The handwriting was firm, but uneven. "You do not understand. It was not murder. She begged me to preserve her, the way she was before the fear began. The mirror was her refuge. I merely obeyed." No signature, but the tone was unmistakably Lane's. Whimsy read it twice, folded it, and slipped it into his pocket with a faint sigh. "Conscience, Bunter," he murmured, "is the one accomplice that never keeps its mouth shut. The poor devil is fraying at the edges. We must not let him snap before tea. I have several questions yet unanswered." At 11 o'clock, the committee gathered in the gallery to view Lady Calthorpe's collection prior to the auction. Mr. Haddington, flustered and perspiring freely, presided with the zeal of a man terrified of scandal. Lane arrived last, his face pale, his manner overly composed. Whimsy greeted him with impeccable politeness, which only deepened the artist's unease. They moved from piece to piece, Dutch still lifes, Italian saints, the inevitable Gainsborough copy, all accompanied by Haddington's nervous commentary. When they reached the Venetian mirror, Whimsy stood back a little, observing both the object and the man. "An exquisite curiosity," he said aloud. "A shame its reflective quality has diminished." Lane's hand twitched. "Perhaps the glass is tarnished with age." "Or with guilt," murmured Whimsy under his breath, but only Bunter heard. The others admired the gilding, the intricacy of the frame, and passed on. Only Lane lingered, staring into the opaque surface as if seeking a reprieve. After luncheon, Whimsy sought him out on the terrace, where he stood smoking furiously, his sketchbook lying open on a stone bench. The pages were filled not with landscapes, but with repeated feverish drawings of a woman's face. Always the same, always fading into shadow. "You seem haunted, Mr. Lane," said Whimsy gently. "Shall we be candid for once? The lady's apparition last night was a clever contrivance. Your contrivance." Lane's cigarette trembled between his fingers. "You saw it?" "I did. Most impressive. The illusion was almost spiritual, only your timing was off by one fatal beat. The clock chimed, and I heard the hum before the light appeared. Electricity, you see, is less discreet than devotion." Lane turned away sharply. "You think me a charlatan. You don't know what she was like, how she suffered those last months. She was convinced the mirror showed her things. Figures behind her, faces in the glass. She said the reflection whispered warnings. When I tried to remove it, she screamed, said it would kill her if she left it. And did it? Whimsy asked quietly. Lane's face hardened. She died 2 days later. Heart failure, they called it. But I knew better. The fear had eaten her alive. I thought, if I could restore her image, give her peace through permanence, perhaps I might also quiet my own guilt. I painted her reflection as she had been before the madness. A touching epitaph, said Whimsy. Yet you forgot one thing. The dead do not thank us for resurrecting them in glass. They resent the competition. The artist gave a strangled laugh. You are cruel, Lord Peter. Merely observant, Whimsy replied. You see, it was not the lady who appeared last night. It was your conscience, cast in light. You must have known I would find the mechanism. That note you left, confession wrapped in sentiment. You are unraveling, my dear fellow. Lane made no reply. His gaze drifted toward the distant sea, a gray smudge on the horizon. Whimsy studied him in silence, the faintest hint of pity softening his usual detachment. That afternoon, a sudden commotion arose in the gallery. One of the maids, dusting near the mirror, had fainted. When revived, she declared she had seen a face staring out from the glass, smiling but not alive. The tale spread through the household like fire. Whimsy, upon hearing it, ascended at once. The mirror appeared as before, blank, inert, obediently inanimate. But when he examined the back, he found the painted slide missing. Bunter, he said sharply, our artist has reclaimed his muse. I trust the car is ready. They drove to the coast road where the cliffs rose bleak and sheer above the sea. There they found Lane's easel standing empty. The sketchbook weighted with a stone. On the edge, footprints marked the soft earth, leading perilously close to the brink. A fisherman, seeing them approach, gestured wordlessly toward the waves below. Something pale floated near the rocks, caught in the current. Whimsy stood very still. So ends the exhibition, he said at last. He sought reflection and found only the abyss. Poor devil. The mirror always claims its maker. They waited until the body was recovered. The face, when lifted from the water, was strangely peaceful, as though the sea had granted a final absolution. In his coat pocket they found the missing glass slide, shattered by the impact, the paint dissolved by salt. Only a faint shimmer of color remained, an echo of Lady Calthorpe's likeness. That evening, as the tide crept in and the wind moaned softly through the chimneys, Whimsy sat in the library with Haddington, who was pale and shaken. I cannot believe it, the steward murmured. He seemed such a gentle man, to end like that, so senseless. On the contrary, said Whimsy thoughtfully, it was inevitable. He built his guilt into a machine, and machines are tireless confessors. When it spoke last night, he knew the illusion was broken. He could not endure to see the truth in his own creation. Haddington shuddered. And the mirror? Whimsy glanced toward the darkened gallery door. Let it be removed. The dead, I fancy, prefer privacy to preservation. There's a touch of decency even in superstition. Bunter entered with a tray, setting down a glass of brandy. Will you be leaving in the morning, my lord? Yes, Bunter. There's nothing more to be done. Only, remind me to send a note to the vicar. I should hate him to be blamed for so unholy a current. He rose, stretched slightly, and looked toward the window, where the last of the daylight clung like a fading memory to the horizon. You know, Bunter, he said softly, there's something frightfully modern about it all. Electricity, illusion, art, and guilt. We've merely exchanged our demons for machinery. The principle remains depressingly constant. Bunter inclined his head. Very true, my lord. Shall I pack the magnifying glass? Yes, said Whimsy, smiling faintly. We may yet need it to see through the next mirage. The world, I think, is full of reflections waiting to deceive us. And as the house settled into silence, the great Venetian mirror stood once more in darkness, its surface dulled, its secrets extinguished. Only the faintest trace of light lingered at its heart, like the ghost of a memory refusing to fade. The clock struck 4, its echo soft and hollow through the deserted gallery, and then all was still. It was the morning after Lane's death when Lord Peter Wimsey, who had departed Calthorpe House at dawn, found himself once again drawn back by the peculiar magnetism of unfinished business. The road that wound toward the estate was slick with mist, and the air held that peculiar dampness that seems to cling to melancholy itself. In the back seat, Bunter's neat silhouette was framed by the blurred countryside sliding past. He was reading the local newspaper with the mild disapproval of a man who finds the world persistently untidy. "Page 3, my lord," he observed. "They've reduced Mr. Lane's tragedy to 4 sentences. Artist found dead beneath the cliffs. Police suspect despondency following illness. Nothing of his work, nor the lady who inspired it." Wimsey gave a faint, wry smile. "The public, Bunter, prefers its ghosts without biography. They like their hauntings neatly separated from human frailty, but it is always the frailty that makes the ghost." As the car turned up the gravel drive, the house loomed once again, its windows blank, its chimneys exhaling wisps of pale smoke. The storm had abated, but the silence within seemed heavier. Haddington met them in the hall, wringing his hands with a nervous relief that was almost comic. "My lord, I didn't expect— Well, that is, after last night I assumed your inquiries were at an end." "So did I, Mr. Haddington," Wimsey replied lightly, removing his gloves. "But I have an uncooperative habit of doubting tidy conclusions. You see, I dislike it when the pattern ends too symmetrically. It smells of artificial arrangement." Haddington blinked. "You mean Lane didn't take his own life?" "Oh, he might have. Artists are often melodramatic in their exits. But the practicalities are another matter. He was found below a sheer drop, his easel upright, his sketchbook perfectly weighted, and his footprints leading cleanly to the edge. Neatness of that order makes me itch, Haddington. A man in despair seldom pauses to compose his mise-en-scène." The steward frowned, uncertain whether he was being addressed or dissected. "But the note, my lord, the one he left for you, surely that was confession enough?" "Possibly," said Wimsey. "Yet there's something too theatrical in its phrasing. She begged me to preserve her." A convenient farewell, almost as though he were writing to an audience. "Tell me, did Lane have access to the house after the first incident, the night before his death?" Well, he might have. The servants' doors are never strictly bolted, not since the rewiring, but no one saw him." "Indeed," murmured Wimsey. And yet the slide was removed from the mirror. A neat little act of reclamation, almost sentimental if we take it at face value. But sentiment rarely carries tools, and the screws on that frame were not loosened by candlelight. He drifted toward the gallery, Bunter following with the silent precision of a shadow. The Venetian mirror still stood against the far wall, swathed now in a dust sheet. Wimsey pulled the fabric back, revealing the dull, featureless surface. It caught no light, reflected nothing but an indistinct murk, as though it had swallowed more than faces. "Ah," he said softly, "even ghosts lose their luster when the truth begins to breathe on them." Bunter stepped forward. "Would you wish me to examine the frame again, my lord?" "If you please. Pay particular attention to the edges. Signs of recent handling, any residue from varnish or oil. Lane was meticulous, but grief is an unsteady craftsman." While Bunter knelt, Wimsey strolled along the length of the gallery, his gaze moving from painting to painting, each portrait a frozen moment of vanity. He stopped before one small canvas, a study of Lady Calthorpe, unsigned, her expression faintly different from the grander portrait hanging beside it. There was, in this smaller piece, a hesitation in the brushwork, a tremor that bespoke affection more than commission. When Bunter rose, he was holding a small scrap of folded paper. "Behind the panel, my lord." Whimsy took it delicately. It was a letter, brittle with damp, the ink blurred but legible enough to read. "My dearest Richard, if the mirror is truly as you say, destroy it. I feel it watching. Promise me that if anything happens, you will paint me free of it. Not as I am now, but as I was before the fear." It was signed, Clara. Whimsy read it through twice, then folded it with a sigh. So she was complicit in her own haunting. Poor lady, imprisoned not by glass, but by belief. Bunter, do you notice the date? 3 days before her death, my lord. Precisely. And yet the coroner's record described no mirror at her bedside, which suggests that Lane removed it beforehand, perhaps to spare her, or to use it. What was it she feared? Reflection? Or revelation? He paced to the window, his eyes narrowing. "Do you recall, Bunter, the vicar's sermon on the Sunday before last? Something about self-deception being the most pious sin." "I do, my lord. He quoted St. Augustine, somewhat inaccurately." "Quite so. It occurs to me that our dear Lane might have shared the sentiment. He merely expressed it through pigment and projection. But that doesn't quite explain his death. Unless—" Whimsy turned sharply. "Unless someone decided to tidy away a loose end." At that moment, a figure appeared at the doorway. It was the vicar himself, tall, spare, his clerical collar gleaming against the gloom. He inclined his head gravely. "Lord Peter, I had heard of your return. You will forgive my intrusion. I came to offer prayers for the soul of the departed." Whimsy's eyes gleamed. "A noble errand, sir, though I'm not quite certain which departed we should prioritize. The lady, the artist, or the truth itself." The vicar gave a faint, strained smile. "Truth has its own afterlife, Lord Peter. It outlives us all." "Indeed. You were acquainted with Lane?" "Slightly. He was a troubled man, but sincere in his remorse. He often spoke of Clara's faith, though he never attended service himself." "And yet," said Whimsy softly, "the wiring for that infernal illusion was ordered in your name." The vicar stiffened. "Good heavens, surely you don't suggest—" "Nothing so ungallant as forgery, perhaps, but someone exploited your respectability to mask their own design. The order was placed through the local builder. You would have signed his accounts weekly, I presume?" The man hesitated. I sign what is presented to me. I trust my verger with such details." Whimsy nodded, almost kindly. "An admirable delegation of sin. Thank you, Mr. Colebrook. You've been illuminating." When the vicar withdrew, Bunter said quietly, "You don't think—" "No," Whimsy interrupted. "He is too transparent for deception, but his verger— there's a man who keeps his own keys and carries more gossip than grace. We must pay him a visit. I suspect the good fellow knows how Lane obtained the materials for his little séance." By the time they reached the vicarage, the mist had thickened again. The verger, a stout, red-faced man with a cautious manner, answered the door. "Name's Partridge, sir. The Reverend's out if you're after him." "Not at all," said Whimsy, stepping inside. "It's you I wanted. Lord Peter Whimsy. I've been curious about a matter of electric illumination." The man's color shifted perceptibly. I don't know nothing about it." Whimsy smiled. "Then you'll forgive me for knowing something about you. You handled the invoices for the vicar's parish repairs, and you pocketed the remainder from the wiring job ordered in his name. Your handwriting on the duplicate, I believe." Partridge's lips parted. "I didn't, well, not exactly steal. Mr. Lane said he'd make it worth my while if I let the thing be installed quietly. Said it was for a devotional piece. I didn't see no harm." "And afterwards?" The man looked away. He was different, jumpy, kept asking about the wiring like he thought someone might find out. Then he came to me again, just before he died, asking how to dismantle it. I told him best leave it be. Next thing I hear, he's gone over the cliff." Whimsy studied him a moment, then said gently, "Thank you, Mr. Partridge. You've been most helpful, though I should advise you to keep from electrical work hereafter. It tends to shock the conscience." Back in the car, Whimsy was silent for some time. When he finally spoke, it was almost to himself. So, Lane built the illusion to ease his guilt. Someone, perhaps Partridge, perhaps another, sought to silence him once it became a liability. The note, the body, the arrangement, all too composed. And yet I wonder if our killer truly meant to kill, perhaps merely to frighten. Bunter glanced at him in the mirror. "You think he was pushed?" "Possibly. Or compelled. By words. Not hands. There's power in suggestion, Bunter. Lane's fear may have done the murderer's work for him." The car wound down the hill as evening drew in. Whimsy watched the sea darken below, its surface restless, opaque, and oddly familiar, like a mirror that had learned to lie. The sea mist deepened into a pale, woolly twilight as Lord Peter Whimsy's car rolled toward the narrow lanes beyond the cliffs. The air carried that damp tang of salt and something older, something faintly metallic, like the residue of an unspoken thought. Bunter, who was driving, adjusted the headlamps and ventured with his usual tact, "You have that look again, my lord, the one you wear when the facts appear to be shaking hands behind your back." Whimsy stirred slightly, drawing out his cigarette case. "Ah, Bunter, it is the mark of civilization that our facts behave with better manners than our suspects. But you're right, they are shaking hands, and with suspicious cordiality. Consider it a painter burdened by remorse, a false order in a clergyman's name, a death too perfectly staged, and a mirror that refuses to reflect. There's a story in that symmetry, but not, I think, the one Lane intended to leave behind." He lit his cigarette, the brief flare of the match carving his features in sharp relief. Lane's death, if you notice, served two purposes. It ended a scandal and silenced a conscience, but it also completed a circle someone else had been sketching. You don't remove a mechanical illusion so neatly unless you've done it before. Bunter gave a short nod. "Someone with both opportunity and technical knowledge." "Precisely. And we have one such gentleman right under our noses." Whimsy's gaze was fixed ahead, his tone deceptively light. "You recall the electrician, Mr. Hurst, the one who swore he'd merely followed written instructions. I suspect Mr. Hurst's devotion to his accounts might prove as selective as Partridge's faith." By the time they reached the small coastal village, the lamps were winking alive in the windows. They found Hurst in his workshop, a narrow place smelling of solder and stale tobacco, its counters strewn with coils of copper wire, half-mended radios, and dust-thick ledgers. The man himself looked up, startled, when Whimsy entered unannounced. "Evening, Mr. Hurst. I hope you'll forgive the intrusion." "Lord Peter Whimsy, perhaps you've heard of me. My interests are mostly in murder and minor electrical irregularities." Hurst frowned. "Can't say as I follow, sir. I've done nothing improper." "Splendid. That should make your conscience a rare collector's item in these parts." Whimsy's tone was genial, but his eyes had sharpened. "We'll not detain you long. You installed certain wiring at Calthorpe House some months ago, commissioned under the Reverend Colebrook's name." The man hesitated. "If you mean the job for Mr. Lane." "Yes, I recall. Said it was for a sort of private exhibition, paid in cash, good as gold. I had no reason to question it." "Of course not," said Whimsy mildly. "Honesty has such a comforting texture when it's paid in advance. But tell me, after the lady's death, did anyone approach you again about the installation?" Hurst's fingers tightened on the edge of the counter. "Can't rightly say. There were inquiries. A gentleman asking if the apparatus could be removed without leaving marks. I told him it could. He said he'd see to it himself." "A gentleman?" Whimsy's tone was soft, almost careless. "Describe him." tallish, trim, wore gloves, spoke like he'd been to school where they iron the words before you use them, said he was acting on behalf of the family. Whimsy's eyes narrowed. Ah, how gratifyingly specific. Did this gentleman happen to leave a card? Hurst shook his head. No, sir, but he drove a dark Daimler. I remember that. Bunter, said Whimsy quietly, be so good as to confirm whether a certain Mr. Haddington owns such a vehicle. Bunter inclined his head. Indeed he does, my lord. The very same number plate we saw yesterday. Hurst looked from one to the other, confusion dawning too late. Whimsy thanked him cordially, left a coin upon the counter, for illumination's sake, as he said, and stepped back into the evening air. They walked toward the car in silence. The fog had thickened, muffling their footsteps, until Whimsy spoke again. You see the pattern now, Bunter. Haddington, the loyal steward, who knew every key, every schedule, every ledger entry. He ordered the illusion to be installed under a false name, conveniently the vicar's, and when the lady died, he removed it again to keep suspicion off the house. Lane, poor fool, must have discovered the trick and confronted him. Haddington, seeing his secret endangered, made one final adjustment to the man himself. Bunter's expression remained composed. It would explain his eagerness to have the collection sold and the mirror removed, my lord. A tidy conclusion to an untidy past. Yes, Whimsy mused, but still too tidy. Lane's death was theatrical, not desperate. A pushed man falls, a frightened one clings. And yet Lane seems almost to have collaborated in his own disappearance. There's something here beyond guilt, something choreographed. They returned to Calthorpe House just as the last of the daylight dissolved into the sea. The windows glowed faintly, each one a square of subdued gold against the encroaching mist. Inside, the atmosphere had changed, hushed, watchful. Haddington awaited them in the library, his manner courteous but strained. My lord, he said, I had word from the coroner. They've confirmed it as suicide. I thought you'd wish to know. How very obliging, murmured Whimsy, removing his hat. And so the curtain falls neatly upon our little drama. Only, I do wonder, Mr. Haddington, whether you might permit me one last look at the gallery before I depart. It's an aesthetic weakness of mine. I dislike saying farewell to art in bad lighting. Haddington hesitated. At this hour, the servants are abed. Then they will not disturb us, said Whimsy pleasantly. Come, my good sir, you know the way. The steward led the way reluctantly, his polished shoes clicking faintly on the marble. The gallery was dim, the mirrors shrouded once more in dust sheets. Whimsy paused before the Venetian mirror and turned. Tell me, Mr. Haddington, what did you see in it that night? The man blinked. I don't understand. Oh, but you do. You saw her. You must have. How else explain your terror when the light appeared? The illusion you helped construct for Lane's vanity came back to haunt you. Only you knew it wasn't her reflection, but yours, projected through deceit. You feared Lane would speak, and you silenced him with a little help from gravity. Haddington's face had gone a peculiar shade of gray. You have no proof. No, only probabilities, and human nature, which is rarely wrong for long. Whimsy's tone was almost kind. You were in love with Lady Calthorpe. You saw Lane manipulating her fears, turning her mind against itself. When she died, you blamed him, and then yourself. The mirror became your penance. You let him build his fantasy within it, knowing it was madness, and when he threatened to confess, you, well, ensured the final act would not be interrupted. Haddington's composure cracked. You can't know that, he whispered. Whimsy smiled faintly. On the contrary, you told me yourself when you said she was a gentle woman, undeserving of such a fate. A curious phrase coming from one who could have prevented it. You've been rehearsing your remorse ever since. The man's shoulders sagged. For a long moment, Only the faint tick of the clock disturbed the silence. Then, with a sudden, weary motion, he pulled the dust sheet from the mirror. "Do you believe in forgiveness, Lord Peter?" he asked hoarsely. Whimsy regarded him levelly. "In moderation. Excessive doses are bad for the moral digestion." Haddington's reflection stared back from the dull glass, pale, hollow-eyed, and faintly distorted by the warped surface. "She looked into this every morning," he murmured. "Said it made her see what others would not. Perhaps she was right." He reached out a hand toward the frame, his fingers trembling. "Careful," said Whimsy softly. "Mirrors are treacherous things. They tend to reflect more than they reveal." For an instant, Whimsy thought the man would break it, but Haddington only dropped his hand, turned away, and said with a kind of exhausted dignity, "You needn't call the police tonight. I'll make my statement in the morning." "As you please," said Whimsy, though there was something in his tone that suggested he already knew how the night would end. When he and Bunter returned to their rooms, the fog had pressed close about the windows, erasing the world beyond. Whimsy poured a measure of whiskey, held it to the lamplight, and said, "You know, Bunter, I almost envy the fellow. There's a certain aesthetic symmetry and guilt that concludes itself." "Yes, my lord," said Bunter quietly, though symmetry can be a dangerous indulgence. In the small hours, a sound echoed faintly through the house, a single, resonant shatter, like glass surrendering to gravity. By the time Whimsy reached the gallery, the Venetian mirror lay in glittering ruin, and the reflection it once held had vanished forever. The crash of the mirror seemed to echo long after the sound itself had died, vibrating faintly in the silence like the aftertaste of a confession. Lord Peter stood over the glittering wreckage, his expression grave, but not astonished. It was, after all, the conclusion he had foreseen, not by deduction alone, but by that peculiar intuition that recognizes the logic of despair. Beside him, Bunter held the lamp higher, its glow skating across the jagged fragments that littered the gallery floor. In each splinter, Haddington's last act seemed to have been caught and multiplied, a man fractured by remorse, breaking the very surface through which he had sought to see redemption. "Curious," murmured Whimsy at last, stooping to examine a large shard. "A mirror may shatter, but it never lies. Even now it shows us the truth, just in smaller pieces." Bunter inclined his head. "There is no note, my lord." "Ah, but there wouldn't be," said Whimsy softly. "A man like Haddington leaves silence as his signature. He has written it well, on glass, no less." He straightened, brushing a fleck of dust from his sleeve. "Inform the local constable, Bunter, and be discreet. I'd rather our friends in the press didn't start coining lurid headlines before breakfast. Suicide, remorse, mystery. That's more than enough to glut the imagination of Fleet Street." As Bunter departed, Whimsy lingered. The gallery felt altered now, emptied of its former menace, yet strangely hollow, like a theater after the curtain has fallen and the audience gone home. He walked slowly toward the window, gazing through the mist that still clung to the lawn. Somewhere in the dark, the sea murmured its endless judgment. He spoke half to himself. "It's done, yet not finished. A death may close a chapter, but it seldom writes the conclusion." By the time the constable arrived, a square, solemn man named Ridley, the dawn had begun to gray the horizon. Ridley took one look at the scene and shook his head. Tragic business, this. Lord knows what drives a man to it. "Conscience," said Whimsy mildly, "an uncommon but occasionally fatal ailment." The constable frowned, uncertain whether to take that as jest. "There'll have to be an inquest, of course. But if you say it's suicide, my lord, well, that carries weight." "Does it?" Whimsy smiled faintly. "Then let us say he tripped over his own moral accounting. The coroner may translate that as he pleases." When the necessary formalities were concluded and Haddington's body removed, Whimsy returned to his room. He found Bunter there already, having seen to everything with his usual unobtrusive efficiency. The tray upon the desk bore the morning papers and a fresh pot of coffee. Whimsy poured a cup, stirred it thoughtfully, and began leafing through a stack of letters Bunter had retrieved from the steward's study. "These are worth our time," he murmured. "Private correspondence, and not of the administrative sort. Look here. This one, dated the week before Lane's death." Bunter leaned closer. The paper was thin, the handwriting precise, yet oddly hesitant. "I have done as you advised. The device is ready, though I fear the effect may be more than she can bear. If she should see herself thus, well, God forgive me. Perhaps then she will understand that the illusion is mercy." "It's signed," said Whimsy, "but not in ink. The signature's been torn off. Haddington, of course, but the phrasing, the illusion is mercy. That's Lane's vocabulary. They were collaborators in more than guilt, Bunter. They were artists in the morbid sense. Two men constructing penance out of reflection. Then Lane's death was not murder?" "Oh, it was murder," said Whimsy quietly. "Only shared between them. One provided the idea, the other the execution. When Lane stepped through that final door, he left Haddington to finish the act. And finish it he has." He stood abruptly, began to pace. "But I wonder, why the mirror? Of all the symbols, why that? The lady herself feared it, and yet both men chose it as the stage for their expiation. There's something deeper here, some hidden geometry of guilt. Bunter, fetch that ledger we saw in the studio yesterday, the one with the list of commissions." Bunter returned with the book within minutes. Whimsy turned its brittle pages until he found the entry he sought. "Venetian mirror, restoration and framing, April 3rd, 1930. Payment received from L.C. Lady Calthorpe herself," Whimsy murmured. "She ordered it. Not Lane, not Haddington. She brought the mirror here and then feared what she had invited. There's a tragic neatness in that. A woman summons her reflection, and in doing so, brings ruin to all who loved her image." He closed the book with a soft thud. "We must pay a visit to her niece, Miss Tarrant. She's inherited the house, and perhaps a few of its ghosts." When they arrived at Miss Tarrant's cottage later that morning, the air was clear again, the sea glinting coldly under a pale sun. The young woman received them with the tired courtesy of one who has seen too many days of mourning. "I heard about Mr. Haddington," she said quietly. "It feels like the house itself is cursed. My aunt died there, then Mr. Lane, now him." "Curses," said Whimsy gently, "are simply patterns we fail to recognize. May I ask, did your aunt ever speak of the mirror she kept in the gallery?" Miss Tarrant looked surprised. "Only once. She said it had been given to her by a friend abroad, someone who believed the glass held more than light. It frightened her, I think. After her death, Mr. Lane wouldn't let it be covered. He said it was part of her genius." Whimsy's brow lifted. "Genius?" "Yes. She painted reflections, faces seen through smoke, water, even metal. But the mirror disturbed her. She said it showed things from the corner of the eye, faces that weren't hers. When she fell ill, she made Mr. Haddington promise to hide it. He didn't." Whimsy was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Miss Tarrant, you have done more for justice than you realize. Your aunt's unease may have been imagination, but it inspired two men to crimes of conscience. Lane tried to prove what she feared. Haddington tried to erase it. Between them, they shattered not the mirror, but themselves." She looked at him uncertainly. "Then it's over. As over as guilt ever is," said Whimsy with a faint smile. "The dead have made their confessions. The living must settle for comprehension." When they left the cottage, the air carried that quiet stillness which follows a storm, the peculiar calm of things returned to their ordinary state. Yet Whimsy paused at the gate, gazing toward the distant house that now stood empty. "Do you know, Bunter, he said. I sometimes think our investigations are less about crime than about proportion. Every sin, every secret, it all strives toward a kind of symmetry. Haddington found his in glass. Lane found his in death. The rest of us must settle for reason. Yes, my lord, said Bunter. Reason, if properly polished, can be a serviceable mirror. Whimsy laughed softly, though his eyes remained distant. Indeed, let us hope, then, that ours never cracks. They turned back toward the waiting car. Behind them, the sea caught the sunlight and shattered it into 1,000 gleaming fragments, each one bright, transient, and, for an instant, perfect. It was as though the world itself had remembered how to reflect without deception. And as the motor purred to life, Lord Peter, still watching the horizon, murmured almost to himself, "The illusion is mercy, but only for those who survive it." The wind caught his words and carried them out to sea, where they dissolved among the echoes of waves and the faint, unending shimmer of broken light. The road from the Tarrant cottage wound in languid curves toward the cliffs, bordered on one side by gorse and on the other by the restless gleam of the sea. Whimsy drove without haste, his eyes on the horizon, but his thoughts turned inward, chasing that peculiar sense of incompleteness which trails behind even the neatest conclusion. Bunter, discreet as ever, said nothing. He could tell by the angle of his master's head that the investigation was, in Lord Peter's private estimation, unfinished. At length, Whimsy spoke, half to himself. The pattern resolves beautifully, perhaps too beautifully. A suicide to close the ledger, a dead painter to bear, the weight of guilt, and a frightened lady who saw faces where none existed. And yet, he drummed his fingers lightly on the steering wheel. There's a discord in the harmony, Bunter, a note that refuses to die away. Did you notice Miss Tarrant's phrasing? She said her aunt made Mr. Haddington promise to hide the mirror. But the mirror, when we first saw it, was hung, not hidden. That promise was broken, and the question is, by whom? Bunter considered. You think, my lord, that someone else had reason to restore it? I think, said Whimsy slowly, that the mirror was never merely decorative. It was the central object in a series of performances, each one more elaborate than the last. Lady Calthorpe painted reflections that distorted truth. Lane and Haddington reenacted that distortion with human lives. What if a third act was staged without either of their consent? Bunter's eyebrows rose fractionally. You suspect Miss Tarrant? I suspect, replied Whimsy, that the young lady is less naive than she appears. Consider, she inherits the estate, a convenient series of deaths preceding her possession. Her manner suggests fear, but fear can be an excellent mask for calculation. And I confess, her account of the mirror's provenance struck me as rehearsed, polished, one might say. He slowed the car as they approached the crest of the hill. Below them, the manor stood like a fossilized relic among the dunes, its windows still veiled. Whimsy pulled the brake and leaned forward, gazing intently. There, look at the western wing. Do you see that, Bunter? A light, faint, but there. Indeed, my lord, it appears someone's inside. Precisely. And unless the local constabulary have taken to patrolling galleries at dawn, I'd say our case has acquired a rather ghostly persistence. They left the car on the road and made their way across the wet grass. The sea wind whipped Whimsy's coat, bringing with it the faint tang of salt and the distant call of gulls. The house greeted them with silence. Only the faint gleam in the gallery betrayed life. The front door, curiously, stood ajar. Inside, the air smelled of damp plaster and extinguished fire. Whimsy advanced softly, his steps absorbed by the thick carpet. The play resumes, he murmured. I do hope our actors haven't rewritten the ending. At the gallery door he paused, motioning Bunter to remain in the shadow. Through the half-open portal came the sound of faint rustling, a drawer opening, a soft exhalation of breath. Then a voice, low and strained, speaking as if to itself. It must be here somewhere. He said he burned it, but he lied. Oh God, where is it? Whimsy pushed the door open. Miss Tarrant started violently, dropping a bundle of letters she had been rifling through. For an instant, she stood frozen against the ruin of the shattered mirror, the lamplight glancing off the splinters around her feet. Her face was pale but not tear-streaked. Her composure returned almost instantly, though her voice trembled. Lord Peter, you startled me. I was looking for something of my aunt's, a keepsake. A keepsake in a drawer belonging to Mr. Haddington? Whimsy's tone was courteous, even sympathetic. A touching impulse, but perhaps ill-timed. May I ask what you expected to find? She hesitated. A letter. My aunt wrote constantly. I thought she might have left something for me, something explaining all this. He bent to gather the fallen letters, placing them neatly on the table. And have you found it? Her eyes flickered. No, only these. Business matters. Ah, yes, said Whimsy softly. Business, one of the less poetic motives for tragedy, yet curiously resilient. Tell me, Miss Tarrant, how well did you know Mr. Lane? Her composure faltered. I scarcely knew him. He came and went. I was a child then, but old enough, I think, to notice that he painted you. Whimsy's gaze drifted toward a canvas leaning against the far wall. It was half covered with cloth, but the lower edge showed a girl's hand holding a mirror. The resemblance is unmistakable. She followed his glance and drew in her breath sharply. That's nothing. A study he never finished. Indeed, said Whimsy. A study of innocence, interrupted. And yet the signature at the bottom, L.C., is your aunt's, not Lane's. Odd, don't you think? Miss Tarrant's voice was scarcely audible. You mean she painted me? I mean, replied Whimsy, that your aunt began a portrait she could not complete, and Lane finished it years later, without your knowledge. An act of homage or obsession, perhaps both. The question is, who encouraged him? She stepped back, her breath quickening. You're accusing me? I'm suggesting, said Whimsy, that you may have found a use for his devotion. A whisper here, a promise there, enough to send him spiraling into guilt when Lady Calthorpe died. And then Haddington, poor, sentimental Haddington, became your next instrument. He believed he was protecting your aunt's memory, but in truth he was securing your inheritance. That's a lie, she cried, her voice echoing off the gallery walls. I wanted none of this. I was terrified of it. Whimsy's eyes softened. Terrified, yes, but not enough to leave the house. Not enough to refuse the legacy. You see, Miss Tarrant, fear and greed often wear the same expression. It isn't monstrous, it's merely human. She sank into a chair, covering her face. You don't understand. I thought if I destroyed the letters, if no one knew what she'd done, the curse would end. She told them lies. Both of them. She made them believe they'd sinned against her. And when she died, they kept trying to atone for something that never happened. Whimsy's tone was very gentle. And so you let them destroy themselves to keep her saintly memory intact. Tears slipped through her fingers. She was all I had. I couldn't bear for anyone to see what she really was. Lane loved her, and she used him. Haddington adored her, and she ruined him. I thought, if I kept the mirror covered, it would all fade. Mirrors, said Whimsy softly, are merciless things. They remember even when we turn away. But you, my dear, have done the bravest act of all. You've looked into it. There was a long silence, broken only by the distant sigh of the sea through the cracked window. Then Miss Tarrant whispered, What will happen to me? Nothing dreadful, said Whimsy. You will tell the truth quietly and completely. The law has no particular appetite for ghosts, and your motives, though selfish, were not vicious. Lane and Haddington destroyed themselves. You merely let them. She rose unsteadily, her face pale but composed once more. You're very cruel, Lord Peter. On the contrary, he replied, I'm merely accurate. Cruelty, like reflection, depends on the angle of light. He signaled to Bunter, who stepped forward silently to collect the remaining papers. Together, they left the gallery, leaving Miss Tarrant standing among the broken glass, her figure multiplied and distorted in each fragment at her feet. Outside, dawn had ripened into full daylight. The sea flashed like a blade beneath the sun. Whimsy drew a long breath, filling his lungs with the salt air. It was never the mirror, Bunter, he said finally. It was the face before it. Too vain to endure its own reflection, too clever to destroy it outright. Every tragedy here began with the refusal to see oneself clearly. Yes, my lord, said Bunter, handing him his gloves. A most uncomfortable habit, self-perception. Whimsy smiled faintly as they walked toward the car. Indeed, let us be grateful then that our own mirrors are purely functional. And yet, as he turned the key in the ignition, his eyes caught the faint shimmer of the manor's windows in the rearview mirror. So many small squares of glass, catching the sun, winking like a final, knowing farewell. For an instant, he fancied he saw a woman's face there, calm, proud, unrepentant, before the image dissolved in the brightness, leaving only the clean, cold light of morning and the hum of the engine carrying them away. The next morning broke with an unnatural clarity, the kind that makes even the most innocent landscape look as though it is keeping secrets. The sea lay still beneath a thin skein of mist, and the air carried that peculiar chill of endings. Whimsy stood at the window of his seaside inn, a cup of black coffee in his hand, gazing out toward the faint silhouette of the manor. It looked smaller now, reduced by distance and by truth. Merely a house, no longer the theater of human delusion. And yet, in his expression there lingered that faint restlessness which accompanies unsatisfactory closure. Bunter, he said without turning, have you noticed that justice, like a mirror, reflects only what we choose to place before it? Miss Tarrant's confession satisfied the inspector. Her guilt is moral rather than legal, always a difficult commodity to tax or try. But there's something left unexamined, something that glints at the edge of comprehension. Bunter, who was laying out a folded newspaper, responded with calm precision. The coroner's verdict was suicide, my lord. The young lady has been released from any suspicion. The police seem inclined to let the matter rest. Ah, the police, murmured Whimsy. Their idea of rest is to lie down on the nearest available conclusion. But I've never found repose so conveniently. He turned, taking the paper from Bunter's hand. The Courier, I see. They've been most industrious. Indeed, the headline occupied half the front page. The Mirror, murders concluded. Suicide of art dealer ends mysterious chain. Beneath, a florid subheading promised exclusive insights from Lord Peter Whimsy, the celebrated amateur sleuth. Whimsy's eyebrows rose. Good heavens, Bunter, I appear to have spoken at some length to a reporter I've never met. I believe, my lord, said Bunter gravely, that Inspector Ridley found it expedient to supply the quotes himself. Then the inspector has a literary streak, Whimsy replied dryly. The trouble with art, Bunter, is that once it begins to imitate truth, it never knows where to stop. Much like this case. He set the paper aside and began to pace. Let us recall the essential facts. Lady Calthorpe, painter of uncanny reflections, dies leaving a house, a mirror, and two men entangled in her myth. Lane, obsessed with recreating her genius, kills himself. Haddington, tormented by guilt, follows. Miss Tarrant inherits both estate and secrets, and in her desperation destroys the last incriminating documents. The pattern fits, but it fits too well. The human mind rarely composes such symmetrical tragedies unaided. Bunter regarded him with that respectful stillness which served as both encouragement and caution. Do you suggest, my lord, that Miss Tarrant's hand was more deliberate than she admitted? Whimsy shook his head. No, not deliberate. But I believe she acted within a web already spun. Someone, or something, nudged events into alignment. The mirror itself, perhaps, though not in the supernatural sense. Its effect was psychological, not mystical. Every person who looked into it saw precisely what they feared most. An ingenious craftsman's trick? Bunter asked. Possibly. Venetian artisans were notorious for embedding illusions in glass, subtle distortions that elongate the form, darken the eye sockets, deepen the shadows beneath the chin. A portraitist might call it a revelation of character, a moralist, a reflection of sin. Whimsy's gaze drifted to the window again. Imagine Lady Calthorpe's vanity confronted by that distortion, Lane's artistic pride curdled into self-loathing, Haddington's pious nature driven toward penance, and the niece, poor girl, living among those echoes, absorbing their madness second-hand. Would you care to prove the hypothesis, my lord? Whimsy smiled faintly. Always the practical man, Bunter. Yes, I think we shall. The mirror, or what remains of it, will have been taken to the local station as evidence. Kindly ring Inspector Ridley and request permission to examine it before it's disposed of. Tell him I wish to confirm that the supernatural, unlike bureaucracy, remains beyond police jurisdiction. By noon they were back in the drafty confines of the village station. The fragments of the Venetian glass lay arranged upon a canvas sheet, each shard numbered like a suspect in a lineup. Whimsy knelt beside them, his face animated with something approaching delight. Ah, look here. Notice the curvature. Bunter. The beveling is uneven. This side thickens at the lower edge, suggesting a convex surface within a concave frame. To the casual observer, the reflection would seem perfectly ordinary, but to the sensitive, the face would appear subtly altered. The pupils deeper, the mouth more uncertain. An honest soul might see its own corruption, a vain one its decay. Diabolically clever, my lord, Bunter murmured. Deviltry by geometry, Bunter. A simple optical lie, yet sufficient to unseat reason. The true artist of this tragedy was not Lady Calthorpe, nor her suitors, nor her niece. It was the anonymous Venetian craftsman who built the mirror. He left a trap for the self-conscious, and they walked into it one by one. He stood, brushing the dust from his knees. Still, it wouldn't do to tell Ridley that a mirror killed his suspects. He prefers his villains with fingerprints. We'll let him keep his suicides, and I shall keep my curiosity. As they left the station, the wind had risen, carrying with it the sound of the tide breaking against the rocks. The sea, eternally impartial, erased the footprints of every crime. Whimsy paused at the quay, watching the gulls wheel above the foam. Strange business, Bunter. There's a peculiar justice in it. Each of them died by reflection, Lane by the illusion of genius, Haddington by the illusion of repentance, Miss Tarrant by the illusion of innocence. Miss Tarrant, my lord? Oh, metaphorically, of course, said Whimsy. She will go on breathing, eating, perhaps even smiling, but she'll never again see her own face without remembering what it cost others to preserve it. He sighed a little sadly. There are worse prisons than conscience. They have better furnishings, but the view is ghastly. They returned to the car. The sun had begun its slow descent, gilding the cliffs with the same deceptive brightness that had once dazzled Lady Calthorpe's studio. Whimsy settled into his seat, eyes half closed as the motor purred into life. Bunter, do you know, he said after a long pause, I sometimes think truth is merely the moment one stops telling stories. Indeed, my lord, said Bunter, though I've observed that you seldom stop. Whimsy laughed softly. Touché. But this one, this tale of mirrors and masks, feels rather final. It began with an image and ends with its ruin. The rest is commentary. The road unwound before them, a silver ribbon between the moor and the sea. Villages slipped past, small, tidy, incurious. Life continued its comfortable indifference to tragedy. Somewhere behind them, the manor would stand empty for a time, then be sold, then gutted and modernized until no trace remained of its former enchantment. Perhaps a family with wireless sets and cheerful children would move in, hanging bright curtains where Lady Calthorpe once painted shadows. Yet Whimsy, glancing in the mirror, saw only the receding line of coast and the sky deepening toward twilight. "There's a curious peace in these conclusions, Bunter," he said. "They resemble virtue, but are really only fatigue." "Very elegantly expressed, my lord." "Thank you. I believe fatigue deserves its own literature." They drove in silence for a while, the hum of the engine blending with the wind's thin whistle. Then Whimsy spoke again, almost dreamily. "Do you suppose, Bunter, that any of them, Lane, Haddington, or the lady herself, found what they sought?" Bunter considered. "Redemption, my lord, or merely a clearer reflection?" "Perhaps they're the same thing," said Whimsy. "Only most people never live long enough to recognize it." As the first stars appeared above the fading sea, Whimsy reached into his pocket and drew out a small shard of glass, one he had quietly slipped from the station's evidence sheet. It caught the last light, flashing briefly before fading into transparency. He turned it over in his palm, studying its delicate edge. "Nothing remains of the frame," he said softly, "and yet the fragment still reflects. That, I think, is life in miniature. Broken, incomplete, but persistently lucid." Bunter did not reply. The road curved inland, and the sea disappeared behind a ridge of darkening hills. Whimsy placed the shard on the dashboard, where it trembled faintly with the car's motion, scattering a few pale reflections across the interior. For a moment, it seemed to hold the light itself, captive, a tiny, enduring echo of everything that had passed. He smiled then, faintly and without irony, and quoted under his breath, "Speculum sine macula, the mirror without stain. Alas, Bunter, we are none of us quite so polished." The car rolled onward into the deepening dusk, the fragment of glass winking softly beside him like the last vestige of a mystery that had at last, reluctantly, given up its reflection. The following morning arrived beneath a sky of cold blue fire, the kind of day when the world appears scrubbed too clean, as though time itself had been scoured by a harsh hand. Whimsy, seated once again by the window of the inn's breakfast room, toyed absently with a crust of toast on his plate. A faint line of smoke curled from his cigarette, forming elaborate hieroglyphs in the sunlight. Across the table, Bunter unfolded a telegram with his customary economy of motion. "From Inspector Ridley, my lord," he announced. "He requests your presence in town. Apparently, something new has turned up concerning Miss Tarrant." Whimsy's brows lifted, though his voice remained even. "Ah, the ghosts of the respectable are always the most persistent." "Read it, Bunter." Bunter complied. "Unexpected development regarding Miss Tarrant's statement. Please come at once. Confidential. Signed, Ridley." "Curious," said Whimsy, lighting another cigarette. "I had thought we'd given that particular mirror its final polish. But if Miss Tarrant has developed a sequel, one must attend the premiere." Within the hour, the Daimler was rolling along the coast road, the engine's hum merging with the sound of gulls and the distant thunder of the surf. Whimsy sat deep in thought, hat tilted over his eyes, while Bunter handled the wheel with measured precision. The countryside unspooled around them in shades of frost and faded heather, beautiful but unyielding. At the police station, Ridley received them with the air of a man both triumphant and uneasy. "Morning, Lord Peter. Sorry to drag you back, but you'll understand once you've seen this." He led them into his office, where a small parcel lay upon the desk, neatly wrapped in brown paper. "Arrived on the morning post, addressed to me, but the handwriting, well, see for yourself." Whimsy bent over it. The script was unmistakable. Miss Tarrant's slanted, delicate hand. The label bore only the words, "To be opened in the presence of Lord Peter Whimsy." Ridley continued, "She left the village late last night. No word to anyone, just vanished. Her solicitor says she gave instructions for this to be sent if she didn't return within 12 hours. Vanished, murmured Whimsy. A fashionable occupation in that family. He glanced toward the inspector. Do you mind if I? Not at all. With careful fingers, Whimsy undid the string and lifted the lid of the box. Inside, wrapped in tissue, lay a single object, a small leather-bound notebook, its cover stained with salt water. He turned it over, revealing a faintly embossed monogram. Eat. Ridley frowned. A diary, perhaps. Perhaps, said Whimsy. Or a confession. The two are rarely distinct. He opened it. The writing within was hurried, slanting across the page with increasing desperation. He began to read aloud, his voice low, but precise. If this reaches Lord Peter, it means I have done what I meant to do. I could not endure the house any longer. The mirror is gone, but the reflections remain. They follow me, not upon glass, but within the mind. I think now that Aunt Agatha never painted her pictures from imagination. She painted from within the mirror itself, each canvas a distortion of the truth it stole. You were right about the Venetian glass, my lord. It was crafted to deceive, but it does more than bend light. It remembers every glance, every fear. It keeps them like insects in amber. I smashed it, but in the splinters I saw faces, shifting, watching. I thought I was destroying it. Perhaps it was only dividing. There is one thing more. Beneath the floor of the studio, I found a panel, old wood, worm-eaten. Inside, wrapped in linen, was another frame, smaller but of the same design. I think it was the first of them. There was a painting within, covered by soot and mold. I cleaned only a corner and saw a face that was not my aunt's nor mine, but something between. It smiled at me. I am going now to return it to the sea. That was where Aunt Agatha said all art begins and ends. If I do not come back, it will be because I followed her reflection into the deep. The last page was blank. Whimsy closed the book gently, as though sealing something fragile and dreadful within. Ridley exhaled. So she's drowned herself, you think? Or gone in search of confirmation, said Whimsy. People like Miss Tarrant rarely drown by accident. They prefer a symbolic geography, but she speaks of a second mirror, a smaller one. That's the thread we've missed. He turned to Bunter. Fetch the car. We're going back to the manor. Bring torches, crowbars, and your usual impeccable discretion. By mid-afternoon, the grey shape of Calthorpe Manor loomed once more through the mist. The shutters hung askew. The garden had grown wild, as though the house itself had exhaled its last tenant. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of damp and forgotten paint. Whimsy went straight to the studio. The floorboards creaked beneath his step. Dust lay in rippling patterns across the surfaces, disturbed only by faint, recent footprints leading toward the corner where the mirror had once stood. There, a square of pale wood betrayed the outline of a lifted panel. Here, my lord, said Bunter, kneeling to examine it. Recently opened. The nails are still bright. Excellent, murmured Whimsy. The lady's archaeology was thorough. They pried up the panel, revealing a narrow cavity beneath. Inside lay a wooden frame wrapped in mold-spotted linen, precisely as Miss Tarrant had described. Whimsy unwrapped it with care. Beneath the layers of rot, the gilt edging gleamed faintly, and within the frame, a painting emerged. It was a portrait, a woman's face rendered with uncanny realism. But the features were subtly wrong. The eyes too deep, the mouth uncertainly smiling, the skin translucent as if light passed through it. One could not tell whether the subject was young or old, living or dead. Ridley crossed himself involuntarily. Good Lord, it's ghastly. Whimsy regarded it with a kind of horrified fascination. And yet, magnificently done. See the brushwork, Bunter. layer upon layer of translucent glaze. She's painted not a face, but the process of decay itself. Lady Calthorpe, it seems, made her art an act of resurrection, Bunter said quietly. The eyes, my lord, they follow one. They do indeed, Whimsy replied. And yet if you move close, yes, see, the effect vanishes. It's not sorcery, merely optics. A trick of recession and contrast. But a trick so perfect it induces belief. That, Bunter, is the essence of evil artistry. It makes disbelief feel vulgar. Ridley cleared his throat uneasily. What do we do with it then? Destroy it as she meant to? Whimsy hesitated. Destruction is too blunt a solution. Knowledge is safer in the open than buried with the dead. Send it to the British Museum, sealed and catalogued. Label it Venetian, circa 1600. No one will look at it twice. And if they do, they'll merely admire the workmanship. That's the only sort of immortality worth having. They replaced the panel and left the house, the sound of the wind swelling through the empty corridors like the surf below the cliffs. As they descended the drive, Whimsy paused and turned back once more. The manor's windows glinted faintly, reflecting the last dull gleam of afternoon. Strange, Bunter, he said quietly. I sometimes think the past is not behind us at all, but beside us, waiting to be noticed in a pane of glass. They reached the shore just as the tide began to turn. The waves hissed over the pebbles, whispering their slow, tireless erasures. Near the edge of the water, a fragment of linen floated briefly before being claimed by the sea. Ridley stared. Was that? Possibly, said Whimsy, or possibly something that wished to be mistaken for her. Either way, the sea keeps better secrets than we do. He removed his hat, standing motionless for a moment against the wind. Then, quietly, Requiescat, Miss Tarrant. You followed your reflection faithfully to the end. Not all of us can say as much. As they turned back toward the car, the evening light sharpened into gold across the waves, catching in the shard of glass still resting on the dashboard where Whimsy had left it. He glanced at it once, thoughtfully, before lowering himself into his seat. Bunter, he said, I think we've had enough of mirrors for one lifetime. Kindly see that this one ends up in the bottom of the sea before dinner. Yes, my lord. The car started forward, and as it moved along the cliff road, Whimsy allowed himself one last look through the side window. The manor was already fading into dusk, its upper windows catching the dying light in a shimmer that might have been nothing, or everything, seen once more in reflection. The evening settled over the coast with a slow, deliberate hush, the kind that presses on the mind as well as the ears. The car hummed steadily along the narrow road, tires tracing the ancient curves worn by countless journeys between the cliffs and the village. Bunter drove with habitual precision, eyes alert to every fold in the asphalt, but even he sensed the gravity of silence hanging in the space between them. Whimsy, hands folded neatly in his lap, stared into the darkness ahead, as though the receding road could somehow reveal truths he had yet to articulate. Bunter, he said at length, voice low and reflective. We have brought closure to the immediate tragedy. Yes, but there remains a matter of the human heart. Mirrors and frames, Venetian or otherwise, account for little when the mind itself can be so merciless. Bunter nodded. You mean Miss Tarrant? Among others. She has, I think, learned something of the weight of perception. Lane and Haddington were instruments of her fear and curiosity. She, in turn, became an instrument of their ruin. A chain of cause and effect, delicate and fatal, yet entirely rational once dissected. The car emerged onto the cliffside path overlooking the waves, where the wind had sharpened into a keen, briny edge. Whimsy rolled down the window, letting the chills sweep across his face. He inhaled deeply, drawing in the smell of salt and the faintly decayed tang of seaweed, and exhaled slowly, as though letting the entire past dissipate into the gale. Observe, Bunter, he said, pointing toward the horizon where the sun was beginning its final descent. The sea never mirrors us. It merely swallows. There is a lesson there, though few possess the courage to see it. Bunter glanced at him, the constancy in his posture betraying his habitual calm. "And what lesson, my lord?" "That even the sharpest intellect cannot prevent certain outcomes when human vanity and fear intervene. We can illuminate the path, provide instruments of insight, but the heart often chooses the shadows over light. Our mirror was never Venetian alone. It was psychological, a prism through which each character saw what they feared, desired, or misunderstood. The truth is often too clear for comfort." They reached the edge of the small cove, where the waves lapped at the stones with steady, hypnotic insistence. Whimsy stepped out, the shard of mirror he had retained glinting faintly in his palm, catching the last rays of daylight. He held it over the tide, watching the light refract across the foam. "Bunter," he said softly, "some artifacts demand a return to their elemental origin. This fragment, with all its power to disturb, belongs not to collectors nor to curiosity, but to the sea that first shaped Venetian hands into deception." Carefully, he let the shard slip from his fingers. It spun briefly, catching sunlight once more, before vanishing beneath the tumbling waves. The ripple caught the late gold of the sun and carried it outward until the fragment was absorbed entirely, leaving only the unbroken, indifferent water. Bunter exhaled. "And that, my lord, should end the matter." Whimsy nodded, though his eyes remained fixed on the horizon. For objects, yes. But for the mind, the reflection lingers. Miss Tarrant may vanish from sight, yet the consequences of observation, her conscience, Lane's obsession, Haddington's penance, remain imprinted in the subtle echoes of this house and its artifacts. Our final task is merely to ensure that these echoes are not amplified unnecessarily by curiosity or misrepresentation. They returned to the car in silence, and Whimsy drove the remaining distance toward the village, the sky darkening into violet and steel. The lighthouse at the point cast a steady, unwavering beam over the sea, indifferent to human frailty, a sentinel marking the edge of certainty. It reminded him, as few things could, that some illumination is consistent not because it is moral, but because it is methodical. Back in the village, the local inn received them quietly. Whimsy requested tea in the sitting room, while Bunter attended to practicalities, the sending of telegrams to confirm Miss Tarrant's safe passage, the brief note to Ridley indicating the mirror's final disposition. All was meticulous, proper, and discreet, a conclusion befitting a tale that had demanded exacting attention to detail. Seated with his tea, Whimsy allowed himself a small smile. There is a peculiar satisfaction in seeing disorder resolved without spectacle, Bunter. The greatest art of deduction is not merely in revealing the guilty, but in letting the consequences of truth unfold naturally, unembellished by the appetite for drama. Bunter inclined his head. "And Miss Tarrant?" "She will continue her journey, presumably to find solace in anonymity. That, at least, is the mercy of discretion. And Lane and Haddington, poor men, will rest in the privacy of their choices. Their story concludes as it must, by self-determination, not the interference of law or curiosity." The fire in the hearth glowed faintly, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Whimsy leaned back, fingers interlaced, and allowed himself a moment to reflect on the full scope of events. Mirrors, letters, hidden panels, obsessions, all had converged to form a lattice of cause and effect. Each character had acted according to fear, desire, or loyalty, and yet the design of consequence had remained invisible until carefully unraveled. "Bunter," he said after a pause, "the fascination of this case lies not merely in crime, but in the architecture of human perception. We chase logic, dissect motive, and trace timelines, but the true enigma is the mind that observes and interprets, framing reality as surely as any Venetian artisan framed glass. Bunter, as always, nodded without commentary, content to absorb the layers of insight his master provided. Whimsy drained the last of his tea and stood. "Let us take air, Bunter. The sea waits, as it always does, to remind us that some reflections can be released only by surrendering them. The shore is indifferent, and that is an admirable quality." They stepped outside into the cool evening where the wind had risen again, tugging at coat collars and hats. The lighthouse rotated steadily, casting a constant beam across dark waters. Beyond it, the horizon was clean and infinite, unbroken by circumstance or consequence. Whimsy inhaled the salt air deeply, letting it fill the lungs and the mind, a tonic to the lingering tension of the last days. "Perhaps," he murmured, "the greatest crime is not in the act itself, but in our failure to perceive the truth clearly. Here we have done all that is required. Illuminated obscurity, restored proportion, and returned the instrument of chaos to its origin. Beyond that, human conscience must carry its own burden." Bunter, glancing at the steady sweep of the lighthouse beam, said simply, "And the reflections?" "Remain, Bunter, as they always will, in memory, in story, and occasionally in glass. But the fragment has gone. The prism is empty, and with it, the power to torment. Let that be enough." The night deepened, the stars sharp against the velvet sky. Whimsy looked out at the dark expanse of water, the sound of the surf like a quiet punctuation at the end of a sentence long written. He turned to Bunter with that faint, arch smile which could convey both irony and satisfaction. "Well, my friend, we may finally conclude that some puzzles are better left with their final reflection in the sea. Let us return to warmth, to quiet, and to the comforting illusion of ordinary life." Bunter nodded, and together they walked back toward the inn, leaving behind the cliffs, the manor, and the merciless, indifferent mirror of the sea. The story had ended, not with a scream, nor a scandal, nor a headline, but with the patient, precise closure of truth laid bare, and the knowledge that even the darkest reflections could, at last, find their rest.